days we're going to get to here in a second. It's less than 11 back here in Orlando. If you haven't got it on, it's probably help if I turn the TVs on. Thank you, Pastor Rob filling in for me last Sunday. Appreciate that. We're up seeing everybody in Ohio. Sit back there. I might just not see it. Sit back here.
It's the left, I think. You see it back here. C, I think, which is C where we're at. Or maybe point two. Go ahead, go again. Actually, start right there. All right, so we did Christian activism and social reforms that were taking place in America in the 19th century a couple of weeks ago. We talked about slavery in the United States and how that had an impact on the societal outlook on people, which then bled over into the church, okay? And that's where we stopped. We talked a little bit about the Christian activism. That's what we're going to pick up at today, though. So in response to, obviously, this, I guess, the societal pressures that were happening in America at the time, there were some responses that churches took. And it began to a leading of, we're going to see the formations of societies. If you're looking at this from they were taking a class on church history, the slavery, the social things the slavery that was taking place in the 1800s led to the churches responding. This leads to a formation of certain societies, and then that bumps us into a huge revival. Okay, and about it's kind of what it starts. Some revival, 1800s, but we kind of get into a big revival there post-Civil War that we're going to get into today. So the Christian activisms, and I've got just a couple of a list of these that I'll kind of tell you some of the things that we're picking up here in America. Again, this is 1850, 1860, 1870, right around the Civil War, post-Civil War era is where this kind of starts to happen. And these Christian activisms were trying to address the great social needs that were taking place in the 18th century. Now, I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. I don't want to spend a ton of time here. There was some legitimate social problems going on in the 1800s, right? People shouldn't have slaves. It's a bad thing. Those were actual social problems. The social problems that we are bombarded with today, to a certain degree, still going to be some problem there, absolutely. You got sin in America, you got sin in the world, you're going to have people hating each other. It's always going to happen. But it's nowhere near to the extent as it was in the 1800s, and it's nowhere near to the extent as what's being kind of pushed on us as well. All right? So these were the reactions to some of those things. 1780, Robert Rakes established the Sabbath schools for children who were just roaming the street. Okay, these children were brought in. They were given a religious education. He taught them to read, and then soon churches took up the responsibility and then did the religious education, while eventually the public schools followed up later by providing a basic education. So Robert Rakes kind of started getting these kids who were orphaned or on the streets running around. He would bring them in. He would teach them to read. He would give them a basic education, a good basic Christian education. And then he was kind of filled the gap there. And the churches did it for quite some time before the public school system kind of was set up, and then began to obviously provide need for basic education. By 1790, there were over 200,000 children in Sunday school just in England alone. So a lot of kids just in Sunday school in churches in England alone. The Methodists in Great Britain marshaled a bunch of different efforts to try to change labor laws in England. These, of course, were to face the harsh conditions of the factory workers. Hannah More was a writer and part of the Clapham Evangelicals, and she worked tirelessly with her sister to improve women's lives in England by establishing schools for them. She also wrote to influence others to support evangelical endeavors. Okay, there was a pastor by the name of Theodore Fledner. He established a women's home for prisoners. He established an orphanage. He established an asylum for the insane, and he also established a hospital for the sick. Flyder trained these young farm ladies, to care for the patients, and he actually called the people he trained, the ladies he trained, he called them deaconesses. Okay, so he developed established these places and then trained the people that were prisoners or orphans. He would train them to work at these establishments to help these people as well. These deaconesses were the precursors, obviously, to our nurses that we have today. Okay, he was kind of the starter of that. And an English girl by the name of Florence Nightingale, probably know that name, took the course and left a legacy, of course, for women entering into the nursing profession. When you hear about nursing, Florence Nightingale, kind of the name that kind of everybody kind of recognizes with that. There were other deaconesses societies that were established as well, and they were there to teach women to devote themselves to helping the sick and helping the impoverished. The Earl of Shaftesbury in England was led to Christ by his nurse at an age of 14. He then went on to dedicate himself to helping the poor and oppressed through legislation. And in 1840, he helped a law passed that prohibited boys under 16 years of age working as chimney sweeps. In 1842, he advocated for a law that passed that prohibited women and boys under the age of 10 from working in the mines, because before that, before 10, they were in working pretty much as soon as they could walk, they were going to working. William Booth, his wife Catherine, left the ministry of a Methodist church to become evangelists who preached mainly to the poor in 1860. In 1870, he organized a mission using the organization of Methodist Society and structure from the military that is now known as the Salvation Army. And that's where that got started. Maintaining a very strong evangelical appeal, he instituted social relief for hard-hit urban areas, and that's still what the Salvation Army does today. Now, does meeting people's physical needs, even though it doesn't save them, is meeting people's physical needs important, even though it doesn't save them? Yes, right? The answer is yes. Why is that important? We're commanded to, right? And that's the way in which we can demonstrate God's love to people, right? By helping them meet their physical needs, we can then demonstrate God's love, the same love that motivated God to send his son down here for us. That's a demonstration for us to do. And then also it's going to allow the door to open up to sharing the gospel, right? If you're helping somebody, most of the time they're going to listen to you. A lot of times they can't help it, right? If you're there helping them, they're stuck with you. So they kind of opens the door to be able to share the gospel as well. What criteria must we use when seeking to support ministries that focus on relief for the poor? What should we kind of look for? Because there's a lot of them out there today, right, where the money doesn't go exactly where they say the money goes, where the time doesn't go exactly where they say the time goes. So what are some of the things we should look for? It's a good lesson for us today when we just donate to anything and everything. Ministry, first of all, should probably be doctrinally sound, right? We got to make sure it's doctrinally sound first. And that we take the time to make sure that they say they're doing what they actually do, right? The money's actually going to where it actually goes, or the resources are going to where they say they are actually going. I think it's important that we're supporting ministries that are also actively sharing the gospel, right? There's a lot of people that are doing a lot of good. There are. Helping people, building houses. But I think it's more important for us as a church, as Christians, to be donating our time, money, efforts, resources, whatever, to those places that are helping people, but that are also sharing the gospel. Right? There's a ton of humanitarian work going on out there. Ain't no gospel being shared, a lot of them. So I think it's important as Christians that we make sure that is a part of the ministries and things we kind of make sure we're spending time with or donating to. And then we want to maybe even go a step further. Hopefully the ministry has a means of connecting people with churches, discipling them, getting them in there. And we want to follow up with those people as well, not just want to kind of run through the cattle chute and hurt it and get them saved and send them on their way. We want to kind of make sure there's some substance to what is going on too. So that's probably some criteria I think probably important for us as Christians when we go to support ministries. You know, God's blessed us with money to be able to support other things, or time, or resources, whatever it is. I think it's important for us to be, good stewards of what God has blessed us with as well. So we're donating and making sure those ministries are taken care of. Okay, so that's under Christian activism that brings us down to more formations of societies. Now this is the 19th century here. Formation of a whole bunch of voluntary societies in the United States. These were created with specific missions to either improve the lives of Americans or to reach beyond to other people groups with aid, and more importantly with the gospel. Okay? Many started locally in churches and then kind of got nationalized and expanded and got big. Here are just a couple of them. The American Baptist Foreign Missions. That was in 1810 is when that was formed. The American Education of Pious Youth for the Gospel Ministry. That was in 1815. Now some more of these are going to sound a little more familiar to you. The American Bible Society, which is still operating today, 1816. The American Sunday School Union, started in 1824. The American Tract Society, 1825. The American Society for the Promotion of Temperance was in 1826. The American Education Society, 1826 as well. And the American Home Missionary Society was also in 1826. Now, the basis of those to start were to help people and to spread the gospel, okay? Which was a lot of that was going on there in the 18 and 1900s in America. It would be nice if we can kind of get back to some of that today. Go ahead, Landon, hit it again. That brings us to our third point here, which are revivals in America. Now, we've already talked a little bit, excuse me, there's William Wilberforce, one of the guys that was involved there, no big deal. We've already talked about one great awakening that has taken place in society. There was a second phase of the Great Awakening, and this takes place in America from like 1800 to about 1850, 1860. The first phase, of course, was 1700s. We saw that once the Pilgrims kind of got set up, 1730 to 1755, that first Great Awakening essentially propelled us into the independence that we have today, that kind of got us started with fighting back against Britain and all the stuff that we kind of talked about with that. About 100 years later or so, we had to go through the second Great Awakening. There was a lull or slump after we gained our independence, right? After the War of Independence, churches in America, the United States, went through kind of a slump where we're breaking ties with the old world, right? We're not following those things anymore. They're struggling to kind of reorient themselves on who they're ministering to as well, and what the needs are of these people now in these churches in this new nation. Church membership sinks to an all-time low after the independence war we had, and there was, of course, restless pioneers that took off westward, okay? and moved away from these churches that were established on the eastern coast. All right, so kind of see a variety of things that began to essentially have a slump or a tapering off of churches post 1776, post the war against England. All right. Thomas Paine's Age of Reason, which he wrote in 1794, did not represent the feelings of the population overall, but it does give a pretty accurate representation of the hostility and the skepticism about the Bible that had kind of entered into the upper class of people in the early 1800s. So there, of course, all those things builds into this Second Great Awakening. So let's get into that. Timothy Dwight in Yale College, 1795. Timothy Dwight, the grandson of Jonathan Edwards. Remember Jonathan Edwards, right? He was one of the really important people in the First Awakening, First Great Awakening that was taking place. So the grandson of Jonathan Edwards, he becomes the president of Yale University, Yale College at the time, and Enlightenment ideas, deism, we talked about, all that stuff influences students, leads to an indifference towards Christ and an indifference to the Bible. It became a pretty prevalent thing. Dwight confronted the problem that was going on at Yale with a series of lectures or lessons to instruct and fortify the doctrine of the college students. And what his biggest thing was when he was talking to his college kids is that he was giving them the essentials for Christian faith. Okay? So you think about deism. Obviously, there's some great being there. We can do what we want to. Other Enlightenment ideas are creeping in as well. He confronts that by giving them the essentials of what it means to live a Christian faith. By 1802, 1/3 of the student body of Yale testified to conversion. Okay, Yale's the biggest college in America at this time. 1/3 of the student body testified to conversion. Many of these came to trust Christ at this time. One of the individuals, an individual by the name of Lehman Beecher, and Lehman Beecher becomes a Christian influencer for an entire generation. You see, go ahead, Landon, hit it again there. We've seen this picture before, but this is Jonathan Edwards College here at Yale University, the Great Awakening School during the First Awakening. Very influential in the Second Great Awakening that took place in America now, but it took less than just 3 generations. So Jonathan Edwards was there, and this was a focal point of the Great Awakening in the 1700s. It only took 3 generations, right, for this to kind of quit. Dwight had to come in and confront the problem, essentially 3 generations later, to kind of get this thing resurrected and turned back in the right direction. So it doesn't take long for this to kind of slip away. So every generation needs people like Timothy Dwight, right? Every generation needs these type of people to keep learning institutions in churches, in people, in families, and all these different places tied to biblical moorings. It's an important thing. It's important for churches to stay the course, right? Yeah, it gets hard sometimes. Yeah, we get tired. Yeah, we get weary. Yeah, we have one-us, and we've only got 4 kids here, or whatever the case may be some nights, or we went through COVID and didn't have as many as used, and it gets a little bit disheartening and different things, but it's important for us to stay the course, because if we ain't doing it, guys, nobody is, right? It's important that it just takes one generation, right? It just takes one generation. I've heard Uncle Tim say this 100 times from the pulpit. You just got a family that's at church 3 times a week, and the kids start missing on Sunday night, and then their kids start missing, and then just in 2-3 generations, that family's no longer in church, right? It's very easy to slip away. So it's important for us to make sure that we're staying the course. We're having an impact. We're changing lives. We're reflecting the gospel. It's important for us to, even in some disheartening times, very important that we are staying the course. Go ahead there, Landon. A next part of this Great Awakening, Second Great Awakening, happened in Logan, Kentucky. 1797, Logan, Kentucky, there was a Presbyterian pastor there by the name of James McGreedy. He began praying for and preaching for sinners to turn to Christ. In June of 1800, McCready met with 5 other pastors, 5 other ministers, and several hundred people for a meeting at Red River. Okay? During the meeting, their perceived indication of a very powerful work of the Holy Spirit. And in August of 1801, a revival took place in Cane Ridge, Kentucky, where there were 12,000 people there. Over 12,000 people present. Theophilus Arminius describes the account. He's writing in a Methodist magazine. Those preaching included Presbyterians, Methodists, and Baptists. The results included a mini conversion and emotional outbursts, and this gave birth to what we know as camp meetings. Okay, that was the very first one that happened over in Logan, Kentucky, there on the Red River. 12,000 people were at the very first camp meeting, and this was an account that was written of the very first camp meeting. At night, the whole scene was marvelously sublime. The range of tents, the fires, reflecting lights amidst the branches of the towering trees, the candles and lamps illuminated the encampment. Hundreds moving to and fro with lights of torches. Preaching, praying, singing, shouting, all heard at once, rushing from different parts of the ground, like the sound of many waters. It was enough to swallow up all the powers of contemplation. Sinners falling, shrieks and cries for mercy, awakening the mind of lively apprehension to sing. When the awful sound will be heard, arise ye dead and come to judgment. So camp meetings, first one started there in Logan, Kentucky. These were used throughout the 19th and 20th century. From camp meetings, we get the starting of Christian youth camps. That started because these camp meetings essentially was a phenomenon that kind of took place there in the 1800s. We see the popping up of Christian church camps, youth camps coming from that as well. So if you lived, if you can put yourself in the woods in early American frontier, and you knew one of these camp meetings was close, probably would have been a few hollers over. But if you went over to one of these camp, would you have gone over to one of these camp meetings? If you would have been just in the wilderness out in the frontier, I think out of curiosity, I think most of us would have, right? Probably didn't have a whole lot else to do once we got the firewood up for the night, whatever the case may have been. We would at least probably walked over to the camp meeting, see what was all about, what was going on. And a whole bunch of people did just that. Some things to be learned from these early camp meetings: strong emotion in response to preaching and singing, which to a certain degree is fine. Now, there has been a fantastical approach to these camp meetings that takes place in churches. They've gone overboard with it, of course, as most things happen. That become more about the emotional response to what was going on and not about what was actually being preached and taught. That has happened as well. But at its core, these camp meetings were very good things. And people were getting saved. It was changing lives. All right. That moves us into Charles Finney and the New Measures. You see up there at point number C. Charles Finney, came to the saving knowledge of Christ in 1821. He was a lawyer. Soon, not long after, he feels directed to ministry, so he becomes ordained as a Presbyterian. He combined strong evangelical preaching, perfectionism, social reform, and stressed the need for temperance. He is well known for instituting new methods for revival meetings, in which he called new measures. Okay, the effectiveness of these new measures convinced him of their validity. That they were important and needed to happen. The new measures included allowing women to pray in meetings when men were present, designating a bench as known as the anxious bench for people who felt urgency concerning their salvation, praying in a colloquial and common language. Perhaps most notably, Finney called for people to stand as an indication of their faith in Christ. This was first met with quite a bit of resistance, as you can probably imagine. You've got congregations who are staunch staunchly Calvinistic here. And Calvinists don't make public professions of faith. It's not what they do. It's very much against what they do. So you can imagine him standing up and wanting people to come forward and all that kind of stuff. Was met with some disdain for a while. But it didn't take long. A few messages later, most of the people were actually pretty quick to stand up and affirm their faith. Altar calls. Right? Charles Finney was big in starting altar calls, which of course happens a lot at camp meetings or revivals. It happens in churches all the time as well. That didn't happen. That wasn't a thing for quite some time. And there's a question here that I ask, what part does an altar call play in your past church experiences? Of course, I've been to plenty of revivals, been to plenty of church camps. There's something special about an altar call. When young people or people come forward up to the altar and pray, there's kind of a special moment about that kind of takes place. And I think we've all kind of seen that, experienced that, and been a part of that as well. 2 Timothy chapter 4, go to verses 1 and 2. And we'll see with these new measures and with these camp meetings and stuff that were going on during the Second Great Awakening, we'll kind of see some semblance here to the way in which preaching was taking place in the New Testament, right? What's the pattern here for preaching in the New Testament? 2 Timothy 4, verses 1 and 2. I charge thee therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who shall judge the quick and the dead at his appearing in his kingdom. Preach the word, be instant in season, out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with all long suffering and doctrine. What's the pattern here for New Testament preaching? What should New Testament preaching be? Preach the gospel. Should it be persuasive and confrontational, or should it be more passive and informational?
Should be facts.
Should be facts, right? Should be facts. Paul commanded Timothy to preach the doctrine pointedly, preach the facts, but he should do it how? Reprove, rebuke, but he wants him to do it with what? Long-suffering and some passion, right? Long-suffering, some passion. He wants to portray the importance of the message, right? Portray the importance of the message. He commands Timothy to preach doctrine pointedly and passionately while expecting the people to respond. Go to verses 3. Let's read down to verse 5. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears. And they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned into fables. But watch thou in all things, endure affliction, do the work of an evangelist, make full proof of thy ministry. Why was Charles Finney here correct in not letting the audience's expectations dictate the way he was preaching? Right? Finney's preaching to Calvinists. Calvinists are very meek, very don't react, don't move, don't say anything, don't have any type of even while they're worshiping, they would do stuff quietly, sing hymns very quiet. Everything was very, and he was, trying to crack that rock. Why was Finney right in what he was doing? Why did he correct in not letting who he was preaching to dictate what he was saying and how he was saying it? What are people prone to when they're listening to something? To what? To counteract it, right? And people are going to, a lot of times, we get comfortable with what we're hearing, right? And people have a desire to listen to preaching that does what? Makes them feel comfortable, right? We like to hear stuff that we like to hear, right? We love to hear things that make us feel good, and Jesus is warm and he's bubbly, and God's just this huge blanket, warm weighted blanket just fresh out of the dryer. We like to hear that kind of stuff, right? And people are more prone to do that because it makes us more comfortable, and it makes it easier with their life as it stands, right? We're just okay with how things are. Paul is charging Timothy to do what to those type of people? When he's standing, what? Wake them up, right? Wake them up. get them out of whatever mist that they're in, the fog that they're stuck in because they're happy with how things are. That's not what the gospel does. The gospel changes lives. The gospel changes sinners' lives. The gospel changes Christians' lives. We should never be comfortable with what we're doing in our faith. That's the whole point of the gospel, right? I said it a lot up here. We are to mimic God. God is perfect. We can't be perfect. Always room for improvement. Always room for improvement. Okay? So that's why Finney, he despised hearing that his people liked his preaching. He didn't want to hear that. He wanted them to feel uncomfortable about their sin and be challenged into making real decisions for Christ. I'm not going to get to Moody today. We'll spend next week talking about him. But I do want to do the prayer meeting revival. Let's finish up. I've got about 7 minutes here. Let's get to it. The prayer meeting revival. 1857, October 1857 through May 1858. This was led mostly by laymen, was not characterized by the emotionalism of some earlier revivals of the century. The occasion was 1 hour-long prayer meeting over the noon hour rather than preaching sessions. Jeremiah Lanphier, a businessman who became a lay missionary, and Edward Colgate from the YMCA co-sponsored a noon prayer meeting that began on September the 23rd, 1857. By September the 30th, 20 people were participating in this. By the first week of October, it had grown to 40 and had begun to occur daily. At the same time, prayer meetings were spreading to cities in the mid-Atlantic and New England states. Many businessmen are impacted by the revival. By mid-January, this prayer meeting revival reached 3,000 people. Its quiet growth in numbers attracted newspapers to investigate it. Its effect was observed in the number of people who joined churches and in the growth of Sunday school attendance. Go to Matthew chapter 21 with me. And go to verse 22. Matthew chapter 21, verse 22. So we had an hour-long prayer meeting that was taking place, and guys got together and said, from noon, we're going to pray for an hour. This begins to grow. 1 hour-long prayer meeting from 12 to 1 o'clock. That's what they were doing. This begins to grow, and we see the results of that, where Sunday schools, more people, churches kind of growing in attendance as well. Matthew 21, verse 22 says this, and in all things, whatsoever shall ask in prayer, believing ye shall receive it. Should we ever be surprised when prayer works? Absolutely not, right? You should never be surprised when prayer works, because Jesus promises us here that God will answer prayers. Next week, we'll do Dwight L. Moody. Came to Christ at the age 17, and was a very, very powerful preacher. And we'll talk some about Dwight Moody next week. And then we'll jump in to the end of the 18th and 19th century, and now we're going to, after Moody, we'll start to see, we'll go back and look at the missionary structure that was set up and how it started, the early Protestant missionaries in the 1600s and moving all the way into the late 1800s, and some John Livingston and some of the great missionaries of our time as well. And that will be what we get into next week. Let's pray. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you again for another opportunity, another lesson that we have to be able to look through church history and be able to see the work of the gospel through the many different avenues and alleyways and wars and times of people fleeing and migrating, and just all the different changes that took place, Lord, from the time Christ ascended till now, and how the gospel has been the one true steadfast. The gospel message has been the one true steadfast, Lord, through all these things that have changed the lives of people. And we're thankful that we get the opportunity, Lord, to study it, to teach it, to live it, to be influenced by it, to have it affect our lives. Because of your work done on Calvary. Because of the sacrifice that was given. And we're thankful for it. I pray that we never lose our fervor, we never lose our fire for you. pray for Pastor Rob as he comes in the next little bit, Lord. You just use him, Lord. Keep us attentive to the words and the lesson that's had this morning.